Opening these videos with horrible puns makes me shudder. Shutter speed is how much time the shutter is open to let light through the lens to the sensor, or film if you're shooting film. So frame rate, which I talked about in another video, is the number of times the shutter is open in a second. The shutter speed is how long it stays open every time it opens. The slower the shutter speed, the longer it stays open, while a faster shutter speed means that it is open for a shorter period of time. Therefore, the longer the shutter is open, the more light it lets in, resulting in a brighter image. For video, this also means that the longer it is open, i.e. a slower shutter speed, the more movement is captured and printed across your sensor, resulting in more motion blur. Whoa, that was a lot. So let's break it down and see what it means. Okay, so the longer the shutter is open, the more light can rush in, right? And that means your image will be brighter. Makes sense. So lower shutter number, i.e. 1/60th versus 1/20th, means a slower shutter speed, which means more light and a brighter image. Higher shutter number is faster speed, less light getting through, darker image. But the lens is projecting the image onto the sensor as long as the shutter is open. So if we open the shutter for 3 seconds, and I move my hand across the lens, it's going to imprint every instance where my hand was the whole 3 seconds. This is what creates motion blur in photos like this. Now, since film is basically high-speed photography, the same principles apply just at a micro level. So if I have a slow frame rate and a slow shutter speed, that means that the shutter is allowing the sensor to be exposed to objects and movement most of the time. If we move through this footage one frame at a time slowly in my editor, you can see that we have motion blur. When you speed up the shutter speed, that means it is staying open for less and less time. So it lets less light in, making the image darker, but it's also able to isolate moving objects better. This is how you can get a photo of a hummingbird in flight and see the wings crystal clear. At extreme speeds, you will notice that motion seems unnatural or stuttery in video. This is because the shutter is closed for so long that by the time it reopens at the next frame, the object has moved further and you are seeing that difference from here to here. Take a look at my previous example frame by frame, only this time I have changed the shutter speed to be super fast. I have also adjusted my exposure with other settings to be able to have a better looking image, but it also will isolate this aspect of the shutter speed for you. Notice how that there is no motion blur, but also notice that the difference between each frame is significant. When played back at full speed, you will notice that it has more jitteriness and appears unnatural and jarring. Let me illustrate it another way. If we're shooting 30 frames per second and we make the shutter speed 1/60th, it will be open as long as it will be closed, right? This shows you a little bit better because 30 times in 1 second for 1/60th of a second means it is open 30/60ths and closed 30/60ths. But if we crank it up to 1,000th of a second, it will be open just a sliver of a fraction of the amount of time that it will be closed. See, it will be open for 31,000th of that second and closed for 971,000th of that second. So if I wave my hand here, in the first example, it will capture the motion blur because it will have half the instances of where my hand is in space. Whereas at the faster shutter speed, the shutter is closed a lot longer than is open, so it can only capture the instance where the hand is here, here, and here, because my hand is moving while the camera has its eyes closed, so to speak. General rule of thumb for pleasing and believable motion blur is to take your frame rate, double that number, and find a fractional shutter speed that is close to that. In other words, when shooting at 30 frames per second, 30 FPS, your shutter speed should be 1/60th, and you will simulate the most natural looking motion blur that we're used to seeing in real life. When getting your exposure dialed in, I recommend locking your shutter speed in and adjusting your ND, ISO, and aperture for the best exposure. That is, unless you know you want a jittery effect. There are exceptions. Take a look at this shot. I was shooting with my friend Maria here using her Canon M50. I wanted shallow depth of field, so aperture was wide open, but I wanted a dark exposure and I wanted to backlight her. So ISO was way down and she didn't have any ND filters handy. That meant cranking up the shutter speed to darken the image and expose for the window. Since this was a calm shot with little movement in it, I wasn't at all concerned about the risk of stuttery motion with a shutter speed around 1/1000th. As you can tell, this is a beautiful shot, high shutter speed notwithstanding. Normally though, I'm shooting at 30 frames per second and 1/60th shutter speed and almost never ever deviate from this. I also do tend to lock my aperture in at wide open as possible, though not always, for a shallow depth of field. I also tend to shoot native ISO, so this means that ND, specifically internal ND, is critical. One more note on shutter speed. You can't have a shutter speed that is slower than your frame rate. Think about it. In photography, you can totally have a 1-second shutter where it stays open for 1 whole second. But in video, if you are filming 30 pictures every second, you can't have all 30 of those images open for a full second within a second. Even Christopher Nolan can't mess with time enough to make that happen. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, because though I won't be seeing you in the next video, you're sure to see me. Rough.